Mr. Reynolds, could we step into a private office for just a moment? The bank manager's voice was calm, but something in her eyes made my hand pause over the counter. I had been there less than 2 minutes, cashier's check in hand, ready to authorize an $82,000 wire transfer. My son Daniel had called it an opportunity that couldn't wait, the kind that would secure both our futures if we acted immediately. I remember asking if there was a problem with the transfer, glancing down at the paperwork Daniel had prepared for me that morning. She smiled politely and said there was no problem at all, just routine verification for larger amounts, and asked me to follow her. I should have felt annoyed. I was 69, a retired aerospace engineer who had managed billion-dollar projects and spent decades making high-risk decisions. I knew my finances, or at least I thought I did. The office was small, quiet, and once the door closed, her professional tones softened. She asked me when I had last personally reviewed my bank statements. The question caught me completely off guard. I told her my son handled most of that since my wife passed away. That was when her expression changed. She slid a folder across the desk and said she had worked there for over a decade and had seen this pattern many times before. I opened the folder and felt the air leave my lungs. Transfers. Dozens of them. 5,000 here, 7,000 there. Amounts just small enough not to raise alarms. All sent to accounts I didn't recognize. All approved under power of attorney. All signed by my son. She told me that over the last 9 months, more than $260,000 had already been moved out of my accounts, and that this transfer would push the total well past $300,000. She leaned forward and asked me directly if I was aware of these transactions. I wasn't. I left the bank without making the transfer, sitting in my car for nearly half an hour, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand how a stranger had just shown me more loyalty than my own child. My wife Eleanor died quickly, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. 40 years of marriage vanished into silence, and the house we built together became unbearably empty. Daniel stepped in almost immediately. At first it was dinner once a week, then twice. Then he suggested moving into the guest house, so I wouldn't be alone. He said I needed support, that mom would want him to help. When I admitted I was overwhelmed by bills, insurance, investments, he didn't hesitate. He said he would take care of everything while I focused on healing. The power of attorney papers appeared the following week, already prepared, explained as a formality. I barely read them. Why would I? He was my son. For months he handled every detail while I lived inside my grief, never questioning where the money was going, never checking statements, never imagining that while I mourned my wife, my son was systematically draining everything she and I had built over a lifetime. The attorney the bank recommended told me not to confront him, warned me that if he suspected anything, he could empty my accounts or even transfer my house into his name overnight. That night I went home and acted normal. At 2 in the morning I heard footsteps. I stood in the dark and watched my son sit at my desk, flipping through my files, photographing documents with his phone. When he pulled out my will, the one Eleanor and I had updated together, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might collapse. In that moment I understood this wasn't desperation anymore. It was planning. The accounts were frozen the next day. When the sheriff served him, Daniel tried to wire money on his phone, right in front of the officer. The investigation uncovered everything: gambling debts, offshore betting sites, personal loans taken out using my house as promised collateral. The total loss was nearly $450,000. My wife's life insurance, my retirement, 40 years of careful saving, gone. In court, Daniel never looked at me. When the judge sentenced him to 7 years, he finally met my eyes, not with shame but with anger, as if I had betrayed him. I visited him once. He cried. He explained. He said it started small, that he meant to pay it back, that addiction had taken over. I listened quietly, then told him I was changing my will. Everything would go to charity. Not to punish him, but because trust was gone, and I would never risk being blind again. He begged. I stood up and walked out. I rebuilt slowly. The money never fully came back, but my life did. New friends, new routines, new purpose. My son took a lot from me, but he didn't take my dignity, my future, or my ability to recognize real kindness when a stranger chose to protect me. That part of my life is still mine, all mine. The months after that decision were quieter than I expected, not because the pain disappeared, but because it finally stopped screaming. I sold nothing, moved nowhere, and changed almost everything at the same time. I changed banks, changed locks, changed routines, changed the way I trusted. I stopped answering letters forwarded from prison and had them sent straight to my attorney, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I learned that healing isn't dramatic, it's repetitive. It's making coffee in the same kitchen where betrayal once lived, and realizing one morning that the air feels lighter. I joined a small woodworking group at the community center, men my age and younger, all of us sanding rough edges into something useful. I volunteered twice a week, teaching basic reading skills to immigrants who reminded me what resilience actually looks like. People who had lost far more than money and still showed up grateful. Slowly the house stopped echoing. Slowly I stopped waking up reaching for someone who wasn't there. One evening, months later, I ran into the same bank manager who had pulled me aside that day. We talked for a while, nothing heavy, just life. Before we parted, she said something that stayed with me. She told me that most people in my position never want to see the truth, because the truth costs them a relationship they aren't ready to lose. I realized she was right. What she gave me wasn't just protection from financial ruin, it was permission to choose myself without shame. My son made his choices, I made mine. Love didn't disappear, but trust did. And trust once buried doesn't come back to life. Now when people ask how I'm doing, I tell them the truth. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm done. And there's a peace in that I never expected. I still miss the son I thought I had. I still miss the woman who made this house a home. But grief no longer owns me. I own my days again. I build things with my hands. I show up for people who show up for me. And when I look at my future, smaller than I once imagined but finally honest, I know one thing for certain. Everything I have left is real. Sometimes, late at night, I still sit in the study and think about how close I came to losing everything without ever realizing it. Not just the money, but myself. Grief makes you porous. It opens cracks you didn't know existed, and the wrong people slip through quietly, wearing familiar faces. I used to replay every decision in my head, wondering which moment I should have questioned, which sentence should have made me stop. But that kind of thinking only traps you in the past. What I've learned is that betrayal doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. It uses love as camouflage, and by the time you hear it clearly, the damage is already done. I don't tell my story for sympathy. I tell it because there are people out there like I was, competent, intelligent, experienced, who think this can only happen to someone weaker, someone naive. That's the lie that keeps it alive. Exploitation doesn't target weakness, it targets trust. It waits for loneliness, for exhaustion, for grief, and then it moves carefully, one small step at a time, until suddenly you're standing in a bank office, realizing a stranger cares more about your future than your own blood. These days my life is simpler, but it's honest. I wake up early, work with my hands, drink coffee with people who expect nothing from me except my company. I no longer confuse obligation with love, or silence with peace. I've learned that protecting yourself isn't cruelty, and drawing a line isn't hatred. It's survival. My son will serve his time, and maybe one day he'll rebuild something meaningful from the wreckage he created. I hope he does. But he will do it without me. That door is closed, not out of anger, but because some lessons cost too much to relearn. What remains is this: I'm still here, still thinking, still building, still choosing who gets access to my life. The betrayal took years of savings, but it gave me clarity I never had before. And clarity, I've discovered, is priceless, and this is where the story truly ends. Not with forgiveness, not with reunion, and not with some dramatic redemption, but with something quieter and far more real: acceptance. I didn't win anything back except myself, and that turned out to be enough. The house is still mine. The mornings are still mine. The future, whatever shape it takes, is still mine. I no longer measure my life by what was taken, but by what remains and what I choose to protect. My son made his choices, and they cost him everything that mattered. I made mine too. I chose dignity over denial, truth over comfort, and peace over pretending. Some wounds don't heal by closing, they heal by teaching you where not to bleed again. And as I lock the door to my study each night, I don't feel haunted anymore. I feel finished. Finished with excuses. Finished with fear. Finished with being blind. What comes next isn't perfect, but it's honest. And for the first time in a long time, that's more than enough.